Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture number 30 of Global Business Management. The topic of today's lecture is ethics in international business. We are continuing the same topic that we discussed in lecture 29. Today we have three learning objectives. First of all, to understand the various philosophical approaches to ethics. And the second learning objective is what are the different steps involved in decision-making processes. And the third learning objective is to understand the organizational culture and leadership, which mostly relates to how this organizational culture and leadership affects on ethics in international business. We quickly do the recap of the last lecture. We had discussed about the ethics, business ethics and ethical strategy. We started from this point. What is the ethics? Ethics, the accepted principles of doing right or wrong, is called business ethics. And when we apply these principles, these guidelines in the business processes, in the business world, we call these are the business ethics. The accepted principles of right or wrong governing the conduct of business people is called the business ethics. The next one is a business strategy. When we make the business strategy on the basis of these principles, which is universally accepted as right or wrong, is called the ethical strategy. The most common ethical issues in business involve employment practices, human rights, environmental regulations, corruptions, the moral obligation of the multinational company. These are the 5 different ethical issues the firm, the managers can face in daily routine life. Employment practices mean to what extent the company is following the employment practices which is universally accepted across the world. The main issue, which is also ethical issue, which is may also considered as an ethical dilemma, arises in situations where when a company, for instance, a Western company, enters in the market of a developing country, where the employment rights of the employees are not well established. Nobody cares the rights of those employees in developing countries. In such markets, to what extent Western companies have to follow the rules and guidelines or some regulations. Important thing is, in their home country, they are forced to follow the guidelines and regulations. In these countries, in developing countries, there are no strict regulations and guidelines. What they can do, they can either avoid it, and nobody is going to question them, nobody is going to object this thing, or legally, they are not legally bound to follow this sort of employment practices. What they can do, they can either choose the practices they are doing in the Western countries, or they can follow the same practices what's going on in the developing countries. It's up to purely based on their ethical standards. Next one is human rights. The same goal, the same concept is for human right issue as well in developing country versus the developed countries. Environmental regulations. Environmental, in some countries, it's not the law is not forcefully enforced to protect the environment. Do these companies benefit from this sort of weakness in regulations, or they are going to behave ethically and they are not going to environmentally destroy environmentally the market. Next one is the corruption. To a great extent, corruption is, or paying the bribe is not acceptable in the developing countries, but they have, in a way, they have allowed firms, when they are going to operate in the foreign market, they can pay the bribe to conduct the business more smoothly, and to conduct the business more smoothly and in proper time, they can pay the bribe. In that case, the bribe is acceptable. Otherwise, bribe is not acceptable in the foreign market. This is what they are saying, and this is their stance. But in their own country, it's not allowed at all. The moral obligation of the multinational company. Now it comes to the moral obligation. Despite the regulation or the government, these restrictions are not very tough, and regulators are very weak. In that scenario, what those companies are going to do, how they are going to behave, there the point emerges is moral obligation. What is the moral obligation of those companies? They have to follow the same practices what they were doing in the West, in their home countries. Accept the rules which define right or wrong is universally same. So they have to behave according to those rules, and they have to follow the ethical, moral obligation, more ethical standards. Basic human rights taken for granted in development. Basic human rights are not, again, which includes the freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, and so on. These freedoms, these basic human rights are not similar across the globe. We had discussed about the corruption. In the United States, the Foreign Corruption Practices Act outlaw the practice of paying bribes to foreign governments officials in order to gain business, and the Convention on the Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials in International Business Transactions, adopted by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, obliged member states to make the bribery of the foreign public officials a criminal offense. Managers often face a situation where the appropriate course of action is not clear. That point mean ethical dilemmas appear in those points. Situation, what are the ethical dilemmas? Situation in which none of the available alternatives seems ethically accepted. They exist because real world decisions are complex, difficult to frame, and involve various consequences that are difficult to quantify. Business ethics reflect personal ethics. Okay, now the generally accepted principle, and the expatriates may face pressure to violate their personal ethics because and the next point is organizational culture. I mean, business ethics depends on the personal ethics and the organizational culture, and business ethics is the ethics. The personal ethics mean the generally accepted principles of the right or wrong governing the conduct of individual. If the personal is really strong ethically, he is going to behave similarly in the business world, in the business, and he is going to follow the business ethics. And on the other hand, expatriate may face additional pressure because because of the environment. Imagine that person has served in the Western countries, and it belongs to the Western world. He behaves ethically in those markets. Just imagine that person just for the period of 1 to 5 years, he is forced to serve. He is sent to China or some India or some Pakistan, and where it's totally okay, totally acceptable for within the business community or within the society to pay the bribe. It makes really difficult for that manager to not to bribe, and especially when its competitors are following such practices, and the environment is encouraging, and in that environment it's not appears really odd to pay the bribe. In that environment everybody is doing and you are doing, it's nothing strange about it, and in a way the environment is encouraging to behave unethically, to follow the unethical business practices. That's why the expatriates, they are facing additional dilemma, additional pressure to behave ethically. And the last one is organizational culture. Organizational culture is very important. If the organizational culture is built on the ethical standards, the organizational culture are the values, norms, standards on which the organization is based on. If these bases are really ethical, then of course the company has to follow the the ethical standard. The company is going to follow ethical standards and behave ethically. If the organization culture is unethical, values and norms, then of course all the decisions will be made on the basis of unethical standards. There are four major philosophical approaches to ethics. The first one is strawman approach. Under the strawman approach, there are four other some propositions. The third one is the Friedman doctrine. The next one is cultural relativism. The third one is a righteous moralist. The fourth one is naive immoralist. The next approach is utilitarian and Kantian, utilitarian and the Kantian, and right theories and justice theory. These are the four different approaches. Strawman approaches are raised by business ethics scholars primarily for the purpose of demonstrating that they offer inappropriate guidelines for ethical decision making in a multinational enterprise. Again, I repeat, the strawman approaches are proposed by the business ethics scholar for the purpose of demonstrating that they offer inappropriate guidelines for ethical decision making in a multinational enterprise. Four such approaches are these. Strawman approach are defined in four ways: the Friedman doctrine, the cultural relativism, the righteous moralist, and naive immoralist. Strawman, the only scholar, the social responsibility, according to the Friedman doctrine, the only social responsibility of the business is to increase the profit. So as long as the company stays with the rule of law, Friedman doctrine says that the only company don't have any social responsibility. The only purpose the company should follow is to earn the profit. That's it, in simple terms. This Friedman belongs to the Chicago School and Chicago University and the Chicago School of both, and the company should not undertake expenditures beyond those mandated by law, those required for the efficient running of the business. If the company is doing some betterment of the society, they have to spend only that money which is legally firm has to invest. Only in that amount they have to spend. Otherwise, the company shouldn't invest more than that money. Cultural relativism, the belief that the ethics are culturally determined and firms should adopt the ethics of the culture in which they operate. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Cultural relativism, the belief is ethical or cultural standards should be based on the local culture, local expectations. If there should be a huge contradiction between the ethical standards of the developing countries. If the company is operating in developed countries, they should behave ethically. If the company is operating in developing countries, they should behave unethically. This is what this cultural relativism says. Friedman doctrine, as you might get, was developed by the economist Milton Friedman, who argued that the only responsibility of the business was to increase the profit. Friedman claimed that as long as the firm stayed within the letter of the law, ethics did not enter the equation. They are saying the only objective of the business is to earn the profit. As long as firm is doing according to the law, then they don't need they don't need to think about the ethics. In other words, he would argue that it's not the responsibility of the company to take on social expenditure beyond what mandated by the law. If there is some law that the company has to spend 1% or some percentage of money or some certain amount of money in social welfare, then they have to do this thing because they have to follow the law. They are not doing because of some social benefit or something. They are following the law just. And what's required to run a business efficiently. So Friedman would educate the use of child labor as long as it wouldn't prohibited by law. Similarly, he would argue that a company could dump pollutants into the river again as long as there was not a law against it. Friedman did suggest that companies stay away from fraud and deception, though. Important thing is the Friedman is saying that, for instance, in the example that the Friedman is providing, that companies can follow the child labor or can pollute the environment as long as there is no law to prohibit these practices. They can follow those things. Because according to Friedman, company has only to follow the law, not the ethics. The second straw man approach, cultural relativism, is the belief that ethics are culturally determined and that firms should adopt the ethics of the culture in which they operate. Their company has to follow the ethics of the local market. If a culture supports slavery, the approach would suggest that company adopts slavery too. Most people would agree, however, that it's appropriate to follow the certain business practices in some cases. For example, remember that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was amended to allow for facilitating payments. This facilitating payment, like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, was also changed because of this cultural relativism law. Because they are saying that where you behave in that manner, according to that culture. If in that culture child labor is fine, you can hire the child labor. And if even in extreme case, they are saying if the slavery is fine in that country, in that culture, is acceptable and is not against the law, against the culture, then the company can follow that thing. Company can have the slave labor. And because of this thing, because of on the basis of similar arguments, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was amended, and they said that because that some certain firms are operating in developed countries where bribery is totally acceptable, that's why the firms can bribe, the Western firms can bribe as well, in order to sustain and in order to compete the other firms. The next one is, under the straw man, the next notion, the next proposition is righteous moralist. A multinational, according to that theory, a multinational's home country standards of ethics are the appropriate one for companies to follow in foreign market. Approach is common among managers from developing countries. Righteous moralists, they are saying that companies have to follow the home country standard. If they go, wherever they go, they have to follow the same standards. This one is totally okay when companies are operating within the developed countries and they have to follow the same standard across the developed countries. They can do that. And according to this theory, they are going to follow the same standards of the home country. Naive immoralist. If the manager of a multinational sees that firms from other nations are not following ethical norms in the host country, that manager should not either actions are ethically justified if everyone else is doing the same thing. If the manager of the multinational sees that firms from the other nations are not following ethical norms in the host country, then I should not either. What the other do as the other peoples are doing. If they are not following the law, don't need to follow the law. If they are following the law, you should follow the law as well. This is in simple words. Like it's saying that if in Pakistan, the U.S. company, the U.S. managers, they come and enter in the Pakistani market, they operate there, and they have to see if the companies from China and UK, they are following the law in Pakistan, the U.S. company should follow the law as well. If they are not following, don't need to follow. A third approach, the righteous moralist, takes the opposite perspective from cultural relativism and claims that, now we are again talking about the third one and the fourth one, home country standards of ethics are the appropriate ones for the companies to follow in the home country. While initially you may think this is the right approach, following it can create problems. For example, suppose you decided that since you pay your employees $15 per hour at home, you should pay employees the same way to do the job wherever they may be located. Well, you will be just eliminated a key reason for making an investment in a developing country: lower wages. If you don't make this investment, if you don't make the investment because it doesn't save you money, then you wouldn't bring new jobs to the developing country, jobs that could be very beneficial to the country. Now, there is some trouble with this approach, considering they are saying that they have to follow the same standard what they are doing, what they are following or adopting in the developed countries, in their home country. Therefore, they should follow the same standard. But there is some problem. This one is giving the example of the wage rate. For example, first of all, what is the reason that companies are moving from developed to developing country? The most important reason is the wage rate, low wage rate, and because of the low wage rate, there are cost reduction. This is the main reason that firms are going from developed to developing economies. Now, what if the firm is following this approach? The firm has to pay, if the firm manager is following the same approach, they have to pay the same amount what they are paying in the developed countries, what they are paying in the US, they have to pay the same amount in the Pakistan. In that case, then if they are paying the same amount, then there is no reason to come to Pakistan, because the reason was the low wage rate. If the employees are paid at the same amount what they are paying, the company is paying in the US, then there is no cost reduction. Then there is no benefit for the company to come to the Pakistani market. In that case, this is a huge contradiction of what is the ground reality of the market and what is their actual propositions. The naive immoralist argues that if the manager of the multinational company sees that the other are doing, they have to follow the same. You might think back to your elementary playground and the old age that two wrong don't make a right. Just because another country is paying off drug lords doesn't mean you should do it too. Now there are some counter arguments for this thing, naive immoralist, that if everyone is doing it, you should do the same thing as well, follow the same league. But the contrary argument is, if the other people are following the wrong thing, they are doing the wrong, doesn't mean you should do the wrong thing, because you know this is wrong and you shouldn't do this thing. Utilitarian and Kantian ethics, this is the second approach. Under this approach, the ethics hold that moral worth of actions and practices is determined by their consequences. I repeat, according to this philosophy, ethics hold that moral worth of actions or practices is determined by their consequences. Actions have multiple consequences, some good, some not. Actions are desirable if they lead to the best possible balance of good consequences over bad consequences. According to this approach, you have to see the consequences. You have to focus only on the consequences. You don't need to see what is right, what is ethical and unethical. What you have to see, what are the consequences. If the consequences are, because there are both sort of consequences exist with every decision, positive consequences and negative consequences. If the decisions consequences are positive, you can follow you can take that decision, and otherwise you can follow the alternative decision. But important thing is moral ethics, moral worth. All actions should be determined, should be based on consequences, not on the basis of ethics. There is one problem with this approach. Measuring the benefit and cost and risk, of course, philosophy fails to consider justice. There are two problems associated with this approach. The first one is how you are going to measure the costs and benefits and risk of a course of action. Because there are certain risks, certain benefits, certain costs which are unmeasurable. Like if you are doing the same thing, how you are going to measure the goodwill that you are losing in that country, or if you are within the market, the bad perception about you is going on within the market, how you are going to measure that. Because might be it will appear or it will propagate within the market within some time, and it takes some time to because might be the sale level will go down in the future, but it will take some time. You took some action in January, and it propagated within the market 5-6 months, and when it people know, the customer base knew about your decision, maybe they stop buying it, or they reduce the sale, the overall the level of sale will be reduced. That means that you took the action in January and the results appear in June, July, for instance, just for instance. But at that time when you are making the decision, you are not in a position to quantify the cost. This is the one important problem. Or in the similar way, the benefit as well. If you are talking about other way around, then in what ways you are going to quantify the benefits of that sale level, because it's not in hand. The data is not in hand. Okay. The second trouble with this approach is that it fails to consider the justice. You don't have the data, or you don't know what will happen in the court, or what will happen if someone brings that matter to the court, and it can be the decision can happen in your favor or against you, but you cannot quantify this thing at the time when you're making that decision. Okay, the next thing is the last one, that Kantian ethics, based on a philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who argued that people should be treated as ends and never purely as means to the end of others. People have dignity and need to be respected. They are not machines. This is the basic concept of this theory, these notions. On the basis of this thing, that people should be treated respectfully as employees, and they are not machine, and they should respectfully they should be treated not only with respect, they deserve the rights, and because of these things they should be the manager should behave with them more ethically. This Kantian ethics suggests that people should be treated as ends and never as machine to the end of others. What does it mean? It means that people should not be employed in sweet shops, because that's essentially treating people as cogs in the machine rather than as conscious moral being who have dignity. They are saying they have the dignity and they have their needs, and this dignity and these needs should be treated respectfully. Right theories. Right theories says that human beings have fundamental rights and privileges that transcend national boundaries and culture. Okay, according to this theory, the human have their rights, and it's across the boundaries. It's the same. Fundamental human rights form the basis for the moral compass that managers should navigate by when making decisions that have an ethical component. Fundamental human rights form the basis of the immoral compass that managers should navigate by when making decisions that they have an ethical component. Whenever the managers are making some decisions, they have to think about the rights of the people, and according to the rights of the employees, rights of the women rights, the labor rights, the employee rights, and these are the things that they have to consider, and these rights don't have any boundaries. The idea that some fundamental right transcend national border and cultures were underlying motivated by the UN, United Nations Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. Okay, the justice theories focus on the attainment of a just distribution, one that is considered fair and equitable of economic goods and services. Justice theory focuses on attainment of a just distribution, of economic goods and services. This justice theory is based on the consequences, again the consequences, which is good and bad. What can happen, the good we can fair and equitable, and the outcomes. This is the important thing about the theory, about the justice theory, as economic goods and services should be distributed equally, except when an unequal distribution would work to everyone's advantage. Justice theory says that if you are hiring people, if you are giving salary, if you are providing the increment or some bonus, some setting the salaries, if you are assigning the duties, if you are providing some other benefits to someone, it should be on the justice. You should do the justice. It should these benefits, these things should be distributed equally among all the people. This is the basic concept of this thing, that all these benefits, all these goods or services should be distributed equally among the employees. Okay, impartiality is guaranteed by the wheel of ignorance. Mean impartiality, if you are paying something more to someone, if you and the other one is you are doing injustice. When you are doing an injustice, mean you are benefiting one person and you are hurting someone other's right. And what you are doing, basically, this is the wheel of ignorance, because you are ignorant. That's why you are trying to hurt someone and benefit someone. Importantly, benefit someone at the cost of other person. John Rawls is credited with arguing that economic goods and services should be. He argued that the impartiality is the same point that we had discussed now. Okay, now what's the justice theories? What system would people design under a wheel of ignorance? A system where people would agree that each person is permitted the maximum amount of basic liberty compatible with the similar liberty for other. Once equal basic liberty is assured, inequality in basic goods, social goods, are to be allowed only if they benefit everyone. Okay, under the justice theory, what sort of system they should develop? They should develop a system which benefit everyone. This is the basic thing. If we talk about certain elements like liberty, then everyone should have that freedom, this sort of freedom. If you are talking about some other benefit, everybody should have that freedom, that benefit, that facility. The difference principle suggests that inequalities are justified if they benefit the position of the least advantaged person. Once equal basically liberty is assumed, the inequality is basically, if the difference people is suggested that inequalities are justified if they benefit the position of the least advantaged. Differential principle suggests that inequality can happen in that case. For instance, just take in this way that they increase the salary at 7.5% of all the employees. What if that's totally okay? It's a justice, according to the justice theories, it's okay because everyone is getting this increment at the same level. But what if with this 7.5% increment, the people who are in the rock bottom, they are not getting enough? What they can do? Might be they can make this sort of this law that, okay, employees up to this level, they are going to 7.5%. The remaining this cadre, this bracket, people within this bracket, they are going to get 10%. This is the difference principle, but we are making this difference principle, this injustice with those people. Why we are doing this? To benefit the least advantaged person. Least advantaged persons को benefit देने के लिए we are trying to making a little bit injustice or difference, and this is called the difference principle. Okay, now implication for manager. How can managers ensure that ethical issues are considered in business decisions? Okay, how managers are going to make sure that each business decision is based on ethical standards. Managers can do the 5 things. They can favor hiring. Managers should favor hiring and promoting people with a well-grounded sense of personal ethics. This is the one way. They can only bring those people within the company who have sound ethical standards. Or they can promote only those people at a higher hierarchy who have the sound ethical standards. Second thing what they can do, build an organizational culture that places a high value on ethical behavior. How can they do that? They can appreciate the ethical behavior within the company. They can encourage that thing. They can reward that ethical behavior within the company. Through those things, they can set the organizational culture, ethical organizational culture. The third point what the managers can do, make sure that leaders within the business not only articulate the rhetoric of the ethical behavior but also act in manner that is consistent with that rhetoric. The third point is they are not just talking about the ethical standards, and they are practically they are doing those things as well. They are following those things as well. This is the third important point. Okay, the fourth important point is put decision-making processes in place that require people to consider the ethical dimensions of business decision. Put decision-making processes in place that require people ethical dimensions. When they put the decision-making processes on the basis of ethical grounds, people will consider ethically. Whenever they are going to make a decision, they are going to consider the ethical dimension of that problem as well. The last one is develop moral courage. Of course, when you are going to develop the organizational culture on the ethical basis, ethical grounds, then you are going to, through some decisions, through some examples, when you are going to set some example, you are in fact encouraging moral, mean you are going to developing the moral courage that people should behave, people should come forward and make decisions ethically, despite they are different from the mainstream decisions. Okay, this is the one case study of ethical behavior of Unicall in Myanmar. In 1995, Unicall, an oil and gas enterprise based in California, took a 29% stake in the partnership with the French oil company Total and state-owned companies from both Myanmar and Thailand to build a gas pipeline from Myanmar to Thailand. At the time, the $1 billion project was expected to bring Myanmar about $200 million in annual export earning, a quarter of the country's total. The gas used domestically would increase Myanmar's generating capacity by 30%. This investment was made when a number of other American companies were existing in Myanmar. Myanmar's government, a military dictatorship, had a reputation for brutally suppressing internal dissent. Citing the political climate, the apparel companies Levi Strauss and Eddie Bauer had both withdrawn from the country. However, as far as Unicall's management was concerned, the joint infrastructure project would generate healthy return for the companies and boosting economic growth, a better life for Myanmar's 43 million people. Moreover, while Levi Strauss and Eddie Bauer could easily ship production to clothes to another low-cost location, Unicall argued that it had to go where the oil and gas were located. The important thing is Unicall has to stay within the Myanmar because the oil and gas is there. But on the other hand, Levi's, they have the production facility of their clothes. They can move to another country, another market. However, Unical's investment quickly became highly controversial. Under the terms of contract, the government of Myanmar was contractually obliged to clear a corridor for the pipeline through Myanmar's tropical forest and to protect the pipeline from attacks by the government's enemies. According to human rights groups, the Myanmar army forcibly moved villages and ordered hundreds of local peasants to work on the pipeline in conditions that were no better than slave labor. Those who refused suffered retaliations. News reports cite the case of one woman who was thrown into a fire along with her baby after her husband tried to escape from troops forcing him to work on the project. The baby died and she suffered burns. Other villagers report being beaten, tortured, raped, and otherwise mistreated when the alleged slave labor conditions were occurring. In 1996, human rights activists brought a lawsuit against Unical in the United States on behalf of the 15 Myanmar villages who had fled to refugee camp in Thailand. The suit claimed that Unical was aware of what was going on, even if it did not appreciate or condone it, and what awareness was enough to make Unical in part responsible for alleged crimes. The presiding judge dismissed the case, arguing that Unicol could not be held liable for the actions of the foreign government against its own people. Although the judge did note that Unicol was indeed aware of what was going on in Myanmar, the plaintiffs appealed, and in late 2003, the case would wound up at the Supreme Court. In 2005, the case was settled out of the court for an undisclosed amount. Unicol itself was acquired by Chevron in 2005. This is the condition that how ethically company can behave. In despite they have to because first of all the problem was Unicol have to operate there in that market in Myanmar because oil and gas was there. This was the first reason, and they knew it that Myanmar is governed by the dictator who is going to do the tropical forest, who is going to protect clear the corridor for the pipeline through Myanmar's tropical forest and protect the pipeline from the attacks by the government's enemies. And in doing so, they violated the human laws, human rights, and forced people to work as slaves. And despite this awareness, the Unicol didn't take any action, and they were just silent on this action of the government, and that was some sort of unethical behavior and unethical way they misconduct that the Unicol did, and they could stop doing this, and they could just go out of the contract and to behave in more according to the ethical standard. They presume that it's totally acceptable in that country, and that's why they were just going along with that contract. The first thing is hiring and promotion. Business should strive to identify and hire people with a strong sense of personal ethics. Prospective employees should find out as much as they can about the ethical climate in the organization. Mean to promote the ethical standard, ethical values within the company. Firms should hire people who have strong ethical standards, who have believed in strong ethics. Even when they are talking, when the company has to promote, to do the promotion decision, they have to bring forward those people who have strong ethical standards and who are believing on the ethics. Prospective employees who are not the currently employees of the company should find out as much as they can about the ethical climate in the organization. Before joining the company, the people, the prospective employees should learn about the ethical environment of the company. Organizational culture and leadership. Business need to build an organizational culture that places a high value on the ethical behavior, and business must explicitly articulate values that place a strong emphasis on ethical behavior. Business need to build an organizational culture that the business culture should be based on the ethical standards, and they should how they are going to when they are trying to make a ethical culture, ethical organizational culture based on ethics. What they can do, how they can do, first of all they can build a code of conduct, and they articulate that code of conduct and stipulate that code of conduct within the organization, that every employee should be aware of those ethical code of conducts. Code of ethics, a formal statement of the ethical priorities a business adheres to. These are the code of ethics that every employee should be aware of, and business must explicitly articulate values and place strong emphasis on how they are going to put the strong emphasis, because by following themselves, the leaders are going to follow, and the leadership is going to follow, then the rest of the people, the rest of the employees are going to follow, and the leadership is going to make the decisions on the basis of ethical standards. Then the remaining the people, the managers down in the hierarchy are going to follow the same pattern. The second way firm can do is to develop a system where people who are rewarded because they are behaving ethically, and punish those people who are not behaving in accordance with the code of ethics. In that way they are providing a system of incentives and rewards that recognize people who they should develop a system which recognize the people who are behaving ethically and sanction those people who are not behaving ethically. Okay, the decision making processes, the decision making process, this decision making process should be based on ethical standard. A moral compass can help determine whether a decision is ethical or not. Moral standards tell you that whether this decision is ethical or not. If a manager can answer yes to the following question, the decision is ethically accepted. Okay, here is these three statements are the benchmark. If answer of those statements or questions are yes, that means that the decision is made on ethical basis. The first question is, does any decision fall within the accepted values of the standards that typically apply in the organizational environment? If the answer is yes, that's good. If am I willing to see the decision communicated to all stakeholders affected by it? Second question. The third question is, would the people with whom I have significant personal relationship approve of the decision? These are the three questions which decide that the decision is ethical or not. A 5-step process can also help manager think through ethical issues. These are the additional 5-step process which help firms to decide about the ethical decision. How would a decision affect stakeholders? The individuals or groups who have an interest, stakes or claim in the actions and overall performance of the company. The first point is how the decision would affect the stakeholder. Stakeholders are the internal stakeholder, external stakeholder. Internal stakeholders are the people who work for or who own the business, such as employees, the board of directors and stockholders. And the external stakeholders are the individuals or group who have some claim on a firm, such as customers, suppliers and unions. These are the internal and the external stakeholders. To what extent they will be affected because of that decision. The second step is managers need to determine whether a proposed decision would violate the fundamental right of any stakeholder. So, if that decision is violating the right of any stakeholder, that means this decision is wrong. Manager need to establish moral intent. The business must resolve to place moral concerns ahead of other concerns in cases whether either the fundamental right of stakeholder or the key moral principle have been violated. Mean if the manager believe that because of any decision any stakeholder, the benefits of or the right of any stakeholder will be affected, what they can do before that decision, they should have the moral intent, mean they should have the consent from that stakeholder, and that stakeholder should be aware of that decision. The company should then engage in ethical behavior. The business must audit its decision, reviewing them to make sure that they are consistent with the ethical code of ethics. When the business managers are making decisions with the frequent intervals, these decisions should be audited and review that whether these decisions are consistent with the code of ethics or not. Now the ethical officers, to encourage ethical behavior in the business, and a number of firms now have ethics officer. What they do, ethical officers ensure that employees are trained to be ethically aware, ethical considerations enter decision making, the company's code of ethics is followed. There are some companies who are officially have the ethical officers. What the ethical officers are doing, the main three responsibility, they have the three responsibility. The first one is the employees should be trained ethically. They should be aware of ethical code of conduct. The employees should know that what does it mean of behaving ethically. The second thing is ethical consideration, mean every decision when they make, they should consider the ethical grounds, ethical standards. The company should follow those ethical standards and consider those ethical code of ethics as well. Company's code of ethics is followed, in the decision making, in the regular practices, the company should follow the code of ethics. These are the three main responsibilities of the ethics officers. The next point is moral courage. Employees in an international business may need significant moral courage because they are facing the different environment. They are facing a really diverse environment as compared to what they are used to in the home countries. Managers need to be able to walk away from the decisions that are profitable but unethical. This is the one thing. Despite the firms or managers are getting benefit from those decisions, but even then they are not taking those decisions because they are unethical, on the grounds that they are unethical. This is really bold and courage. It needs really courage, moral courage. Employees need to be able to say no to actions that are unethical. That's another really difficult thing. Employees should have the moral courage as well, and they should say no to the actions that are unethical. Okay. Now this is the one small case study, story of corruption at Daimler, automobile Chrysler Daimler. In 1998, Daimler, one of the world's largest manufacturers of automobiles, purchased the Chrysler Corporation. Soon afterward, a former Chrysler auditor identified suspicious payments being made by subsidiaries. For example, in 2002, Daimler's Chinese subsidiary paid $25,000 to a Texas company listed at the residential apartment complex in Houston. The auditor suspected that such payments were bribes and reported the issue to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which then teamed up with the Department of Justice and began an investigation. The investigation took 8 years. During that time, investigators uncovered a pattern of corruption so widespread that an Securities Exchange official described it as standard operating practices at Daimler. In the case of the $25,000 payment, the Texas company was a shell organizer established to launder the money, and the payment was to be passed on to the wife of a Chinese government official who was involved in contract negotiation for about $1.3 million in commercial vehicles. In another case, bribes were given to secure the sale of passenger and commercial vehicles to government entities in Russia. Daimler overcharged for the cars on invoices and passed the overpayment to the bank account in Latvia, controlled by the Russian officials responsible for the purchase decisions. In certain cases, Daimler made bribes from cash desks, allowing employees to take out large amount of currency to make payments to foreign officials. These are the different instances where Daimler was indulged in the bribery and making some corrupt payment, some payment to smoothen their business and get some contracts. In total, the investigation uncovered hundreds of such payments in at least 22 countries that were linked to the sale of vehicles valued at 1.9 billion US dollars. The SEC stated the bribery was so pervasive in Daimler decentralized corporate culture that it extended outside of the sale organization to internal audit, legal and finance departments. These departments should have caught and spotted the illegal sale practices, but instead they were permitted or directly involved in the company's bribery practices. The Security Exchange, they pointed out that the Daimler was practicing this bribery since 10 years, and it was so widespread that the company's auditors, the legal department, the finance department should be spotted this earlier as well, but they didn't do it, and they allowed to happen this sort of practices without any notice. Threatened with court proceeding in the United States in 2010, Daimler entered into a consent decree with the Security Exchange Commission, under which it agrees to pay 187 million US dollar in criminal and civil fines. While subsidiaries of Daimler in Germany and Russia plead guilty to corruption charges, the corporate parent and the Chinese subsidiary will avoid incitement so long as they live up to an agreement to halt such practices. They had to pay the fine because of such practices, and the headquarter one, the Daimler headquarter, and the German and Russian subsidiary, they were also guilty of corruption charges. Okay, now let's talk about the summary of the decision-making steps. What are the main important decision-making steps? They were in decision-making. International businesses should strive to hire and promote the people based on ethical standards, like we said. Establish an ethical culture within the organization. Appoint ethical officers. This is the third thing. Like just in the case study that we have seen, that the various departments, they didn't pointed out the bribe payments. Ethical officers could do this thing. Create an environment that facilitates moral courage. Again apply all these points to that Daimler case study, we can see this thing that if they have this sort of thing, that problem could be pointed out earlier. It is important to recognize that not all ethical dilemmas have a clear and obvious solution. So all these steps can help foster an ethical, responsible firm. It is not necessary that only taking the one step will solve the problem, or bringing back the firm on the ethical ground or the ethical pathway. But what they can do, firm can initiate all those 4 steps. And but remember, we have mentioned before, sometimes they are no good answer to an issue. Manager must simply try to make sense of the situation and make a balanced decision. This is when there is some ambiguity and that's very difficult to make a decision, then they are not going to make a explicit decision. What they can do, try to make sense of a situation and make a balanced decision. Quick review question is: the multinational companies are concerned with ethics in all of the following areas except employees' practices, human rights, environmental regulations, and trade regulation. Answer of this question exists in the previous slides. Which of the following does not contribute to unethical behavior by managers? Unrealistic performance goals, leadership, organizational culture, restrictions on bribes. Okay, the next question is: which philosophy claims that the company's home country standards of the ethics are the appropriate one to follow in the foreign countries? Cultural relativism, righteous moralist, Friedman doctrine, and the naive immoralist? Answer of this question is in the earlier slides of this lecture, where we have discussed the philosophical approaches. A company's formal statement of the ethical priorities is called its mission statement, code of ethics, code of values, organizational culture. We have discussed this point very repeatedly, and you should know this answer in an instant. Otherwise, answer exists in the previous slide. Okay, and let's talk about the summary of the lecture. This is the summary of the today's lecture. We had discussed the philosophical approaches, and we had discussed the strawman approach, utilitarian and the Kantian approach, right theorist and a justice theorist, and what the step manager should take: the favor hiring and promoting people with a well-grounded sense of personal ethics, build organization culture, make sure the leaders with the business are not only articulate the ethical behavior but also acting upon that thing, put decision-making process in place that require people to consider ethical decision making, develop moral courage. The next point that we have discussed is organization culture and leadership. Business need to build organization culture that places a high value on ethical standards. A 5-step process can also help managers think ethical issues. The first one is how it affects on the stakeholders. Manager need to determine whether a proposed decision violates the fundamental right of the stakeholders. And the last one is the moral intent. That's it for today. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.